So last time we're looking at the gender equality, and now we move away from the issue of gender equality to race and ethnicity. The reading for this, or the discussion for this, centers around Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. A little background for him. He was born in Atlanta on January 15, 1929. He married Coretta Scott on June 18, 1953, and was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. He got a BA in sociology from Morehouse in 1948, rejected by Yale Divinity, which I'm sure they regret to this day. 1951, he got a Bachelor of Divinity from Crozier Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, which they're probably driven by, because no one drives to Pennsylvania. And in 1955, he got his PhD in systematic theology from Boston University, also known as BU. His accomplishments, of course, are well known and well established. A Nobel laureate, a Baptist minister, a civil rights leader, and of course one of the best known American leaders. And he's, in terms of his philosophical contributions, he's known for developing civil disobedience from a philosophical view, which was developed by our good dead friend Henry David Thoreau, which we'll see in the next section, applied by Dr. Plottery Indira Gandhi, and then brought back to the United States for civil rights. And what we'll focus on for Dr. King is, of course, the classic and apparently fully copyrighted, so you can't see it on YouTube, I Am a Dream speech, which everyone knows pretty well. Now, this particular speech provides a very interesting context for a discussion of the matter of ethnicity / race and equality. Now, he's giving the speech on the occasion of the Emancipation Proclamation. And this particular speech was given on August 28, 1963. The Emancipation Proclamation had been issued on August 28, 1863. So he was speaking 100 years after that. Of course, interestingly enough, we are now in 2015, which is 52 years out from that. So he was 100 years out from the Emancipation Proclamation, and we're 50 years out from his speech, about half that length, which is certainly interesting and relevant. Now, one thing, of course, to consider is looking at it both historically, or rather two things to consider, is comparing, as he does, between 1963 and 1863, but also, of course, looking at the comparison between, 2015 and 1963, 50 years later. Now, from the standpoint of race, was 1963 an improvement over 1863? Well, was this worse than this?
Yes.
Yes. How so?
Laws?
Yeah. I mean, there were laws, Civil War, and yeah, so things were, by all reasonable measures, worse in 1863. Now, even in 1963, things have improved since 1863, but King lays out the following problems that he considers, which are these. First, lack of freedom. Secondly, segregation. Discrimination. And what's often forgotten is poverty. It's often forgotten that the March on Washington was not just for justice, but also relating to economic situation. Now, in 1963, Dr. King was noting how, even though it's 100 years later after the Emancipation Proclamation, lack of freedom still an issue, segregation still clear an issue, discrimination clear an issue, and poverty still remaining. We're now, of course, 50 years out from 1960, or 52 years out from 1963. So, what's improved, what's gotten worse, and what hasn't improved? Well, what about freedom? Is there, in terms of race and ethnicity, is there more, less, or the same freedom in 2015 as there was in 1963? In general or in particular? Because of course, it may vary depending on particular circumstances.
More.
How so? How are people more free?
In terms of African Americans,
Yes, or we could go with any, ethnicity.
there's more rights
Mhm.
that we have now compared to 1963.
Yeah. These include,
We can vote.
is voting. Voting's,
We vote back then, but voting wasn't.
They have more laws.
Yeah, different.
yeah, then they were,
Mind games back then compared to now. It's straightforward now.
yeah, I mean, we had the,
The Jim Crow laws.
yeah, Jim Crow laws, and we had the Voters' Rights Act, which was designed to counter those.
Discrimination.
Yeah, and there's, all sorts of, a lot of legal issues that are now, well, were resolved. Now, are there some things, in regards to like freedom of like voting, that are still a thing in 2015? Well, what happened to the Voters' Rights Act recently? Because it was created in response to, states, even though all citizens had the right to vote, states were systematically denying people the right to vote. And so the Voters' Rights Act was proposed. One of the requirements was that certain states, which had a history of denying people the vote, they had to get like pre-approval from the federal government to change how the voting worked, like what the requirements were, etc. And recently, what happened to that provision? Oh, the Supreme Court struck it down. Like, a case was brought up against it, and the Supreme Court said things are fine now, not a problem. And what did states immediately do?
Same.
Yeah, I mean, we had, because one of the debates going on now is, the reason why the Voters' Rights Act was being questioned is because some states wanted to have voter ID requirements, you have to have ID to vote. Some wanted to change things such that early voting would not occur, to limit, the number of polling places, polling hours, how, in some states were taking away, used to be you could register right after right up to election day. You could register and vote. And so some states were trying to get rid of that. Now, the people who support those claim they're trying to do what? I mean, yeah, they're saying they're trying to address voter fraud. And the people who are critical and say that those things are, voter ID requirements, getting rid of, early voting, getting rid of late registration, reducing the number of polling places and cutting their hours, the claim is they're trying to do what?
Prevent people from voting.
Yeah, prevent people from voting, civically minorities. And the claim is that typically, supposedly, minorities vote more for Democrats, and so people claim the Republicans are doing this basically to win. And the Republicans claim their concern is with voter fraud. And so we still have that concern today. Like I said, the Voters' Rights Act, which was passed during the Civil Rights Movement to try to address those problems, big chunk that's been removed. And so it's a fair question to ask, what impact does that have on voting? Are people being disenfranchised? And some people say yes, and some people say it doesn't have a big impact, and they're trying to protect us from voter fraud. So if you're looking for an issue to write on, one interesting issue that's relevant to today is that moral issue. One way to look at it is this. We know that we have in the legal system a presumption of, I suppose I'm arrested for a terrible crime. I'm presumed to be what?
Innocent until proven guilty.
Yeah, it's because the idea is that it's better that a guilty person go free than an innocent person be punished. And so looking at, the idea of voter fraud, we don't want people voting illegally. Because the whole point of being a citizen is you get to vote and have rights, etc. And so one way to approach it morally is which would be worse? To have one person vote fraudulently because we don't have, as strict requirements, or would it be worse that in trying to prevent the person from voting fraudulently, we denied a person the right to vote? And so it's an important moral issue. Should, things like voter ID laws and other such laws, are they morally acceptable? And one thing that, going back to 1963, is the question, which is more important? Guaranteeing that everyone who should vote be allowed to vote, even though they might let people who are, voting legally in, or is it preferable to disenfranchise some people to keep some people from voting illegally? And it's a moral issue. Yeah, so freedom, still an issue. Now we'll turn now to the kind of the bigger three, or part of the, I guess we have big four as well. Segregation. What's that?
Separate people
Yeah.
by color.
People are separated civically if we do it on the basis of race or color, it's separated by color. In 1863, was that a problem? Was that a thing?
Yes.
Yeah, there's a thing pretty much everywhere. People talk, people want to think that, like the northern states were, nice, but, if you look at New York and Boston, etc., highly segregated. And we jump up to 1963, segregation is still a thing?
That's what
Yeah, definitely still a thing. We jump up to 2015, segregation is still a thing?
no, not really.
Well, legally. Is it legal to tell someone, suppose someone's going to buy a house. Can the realtor legally say, I'd love to sell you this house, but you are insufficiently white. I cannot sell you this house. You have to be this white to buy this house. No, legally you can't do that. But
Doesn't happen.
does segregation occur despite the fact that it's illegal? Yeah, because the laws are against, enforce segregation. They can't tell people if you're of this skin color, you must live here. If you're this skin color, you must live here. But does it still occur?
I guess you can say yes, a little bit, because like, let's say, you can't say, oh, you can't stay here because you're black or non-white, but you can make the prices high and some people can't afford it, which can be a little segregated.
Yeah, exactly right. Because you can't, as you said, you can't say you got to be white to live here, but you can set the price a certain way, and then that will, because of economic factors, that creates sort of a economic segregation. And is there more segregation now than in '63? Interestingly, and awfully enough, in many cases, yes. Civically, one key part of segregation is, of course, schools. Because we know that a key factor in social mobility, moving up, is education. That's one of the, aside from like winning the lottery, that's the main way to move up. That's, in my case, my family, my grandparents, my father's side, their parents died young, so they didn't even finish high school. And so they had to go and work and take care of their family. And so not even finishing high school. My dad was the first person outside the family to finish high school, first one to go to college, and first one to get a master's degree. So I was obligated to top that and get a PhD. So if I have kids, I guess I'll have to get like double doctorates or something to top that. Or maybe they'll be rock stars or something, poets, something horrible. Yeah, so schools are very, very important. Now, are schools segregated today? Well, we went through a whole thing you might have heard in your history classes where they had the whole busing, desegregation. They have, forced busing. And I remember when I was a kid, I don't remember being, I'm from a tiny town, so we had like a bus. Well, maybe two, maybe three. Well, we had a few buses. But small town. But a lot of places did try to segregate because they would bring people, because of the segregation of where people lived, they tried to desegregate by busing people various places. And then they just kind of gave up on that. So segregation actually in public schools is higher now than it was back then, in part because they kind of gave up on desegregation and just said, well, people go to school where they live. And so once you have segregation, economically, the schools, of course, you go to school where you live. And so then the schools become segregated. They're actually more segregated now than before. Now, a good question is, of course, is that bad? Well, because we have to, in a way, we can look at segregation a couple ways. One is, do people have a right to live with who they want to live with? Should we force people to, say, okay, we got to force people to live, create neighborhoods, that are diverse? Well, no, that'd be a violation of freedom as well. Keeping people out would be, or forcing people, to do that would both be a violation of rights. So if people voluntarily segregate, we might say, well, people are choosing. If people are freely choosing, then we can't force them. We shouldn't compel them. And people do segregate based on, common factors. I think to use one example, the first time I got someone for jury duty, this is back when papers were graded, printed and graded, and I brought my papers to grade. And you can always spot a professor because if they're waiting someplace, this is back before the blackboard, and they'd always just be grading stuff because they always had stuff, lots of stuff to grade by hand. And there are a couple other people there, and we recognize each other because it's like the society of the red pen. If someone's got a red pen, they're probably a teacher or professor. And so we all kind of gathered together and started talking. People from FSU, FAMU, TCC. And so we kind of segregated ourselves from other people based on common interests. But we weren't doing anything wrong. Just like people are interested in sports or games or interested in literature or poetry. So we might say, well, segregation, as long as it's voluntary, we may think, okay, it'd be better if people live together, but we really can't compel people because that would be wrong. So is there anything wrong with segregation? Well, let's take the example of schools. Why could that be seen as bad, morally?
You said why is segregation bad when it's in schools?
Yeah, even if it's theoretically voluntary, that people are not legally, forbidden.
Because some schools are better than others, and if you can move up in the world from education, then some people don't have a fair shot.
Yeah, as a matter of objective, fact, basically studies and causation shows that the schools tend to be worse. And as you noted, a person's success later in life is strongly linked to education, K through 12 and beyond. It's a clear correlation. And so one thing you'd say would be unfair about it is the person has far less chances for success. And that's something that just, and if they don't succeed, what happens to their kids? Yeah, the same scenario. Like my own case, my family was able to, this is kind of the American dream. Like I said, my grandparents didn't even finish high school. They worked in a shoe factory, making shoes. And they decided that they didn't want their son, or children to be making shoes. It was a good job, but they could tell that wasn't going to be a job for long. In fact, that's what happened. Maine used to produce a lot of shoes. Anybody buy any Maine shoes recently? No, actually, yeah, shoes made in Maine. We don't do that anymore. Manufacturing's overseas, probably someplace like China. Yeah, and so schools were a way out. Go to a good school, you move up the social mobility. But of course, if people are in bad school, then they're kind of stuck, and so their kids are still stuck. Yeah, so that segregation seems bad. So We still have segregation. In fact, as I noted, it's in some ways worse than it was before. A good question is, why is that? Well, you gave one answer, economics, is a major factor, because, most people, parents generally try to live in the best place they can. I mean, people I know that have kids, I know sometimes they buy outside of their means just to be in a good school district, because they know what a huge difference it makes. I mean, this is something that everybody knows. Everyone knows the good schools and the bad schools, where they are, and the good schools are always in the expensive, neighborhoods. In part because the way the expensive neighborhoods have more influence, they get better schools, and of course the school funding largely rests, a lot of it rests on property taxes. So if you have like very expensive houses, the schools have more of a budget. If you have lower property values, less money, less budget. So should anything be done about that, morally? Is that something that should be addressed? Or should we just say, well, just the way it works out. If you're in this neighborhood, which is segregated, but we're not forcing people to stay there, and the schools are inferior because the people don't have as much influence or money, and that's just the way things are. Life's not fair. Or should something be done?
Something should be done, you just don't know what should be done, or how would you go about fixing that, if it's going off of the house's taxes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people, I mean, this again is going to be a topic for, if you're still looking for a subject for the paper. People propose various things. One is delinking school funding from the particular neighborhoods. So instead of, if it's a rich neighborhood, the schools get the money, having it being done like at the state level. So it all goes into like a state coffer, and it gets divided up more equitably. Another approach has been to, people have tried to do things, well, one approach has been to do the school voucher system, where people get vouchers and people can send their kids to school anywhere that I guess they can get them to. That's been one proposal. But then people of course raise objection against the school voucher system, namely that people would voucher out to the good schools who could, and the local schools would collapse and be even worse than they were before. Yeah, so segregation does still seem to be a thing. And one of the main impacts is, schools. And that, of course, just cascades on up. Now, one reason, of course, for the segregation is discrimination. And discrimination is what?
When you treat others differently based on, I don't know, maybe their race or their age or gender, many reasons.
Yeah. Yeah, there's various types, as you point out, there's various types of discrimination. But it's, there's what we might call good discrimination, in the sense that someone is discriminating. If someone has said they're discriminating when it comes to their friends, it may not mean they're racist, it may mean they're just picky. But yeah, we generally think of discrimination as you pointed out, where someone judges or treats people differently based on factors that are not actually relevant. Like I said, age, gender, ethnicity, race, religion, etc. Now, if we go back to 1863, was there a lot of discrimination?
Yes.
Yeah, it was the order of the day. If we went back to 1963, would there still be a lot of discrimination?
Yes.
Now, if we leap ahead to 2015, is there still discrimination?
Yes.
Is there less than 1963? Really? How so?
Because in 1963, you discriminated against, it was more so blacks
Mm-hmm.
more than anything, but now it's a lot of different groups that you discriminate. Now you have gays who get discriminated a lot more because they're a lot more open.
Mm-hmm.
Religion seems to be discriminated a lot more. So I feel like more than 1963.
Yeah, good. Yeah, good point. That people are, a lot of discrimination then, but as you point out, in a way we have a more diverse society, and so there are more people to discriminate, sort of ironically, against. Yeah, what are some examples of, say, discrimination based on religion that occurs?
Muslims, you could say that. I guess ever since the terrorist attacks, there's discriminated a lot more. I guess people feel they're more a violent religion more so than back what they were in 1963. In 1963, you really didn't have heavy Muslims like you had now. You had, Muslims, the black Islam, more so now, but I feel like religion is a lot more. You have atheists, they're a lot more than what they used to be in 1963. It's a more open society, so there's going to be more discrimination.
Yeah, and people have said they would accept a gay president over an atheist president. Even, other example of discrimination was when Mitt Romney ran in 2012. There were people attacking him for being a Mormon. And Ben Carson, who's a Seventh-day Adventist, he was here yesterday signing books at Books A Million, and there were some people protesting not his political views, but his religion. Yeah, so we do have plenty of discrimination. Now, is discrimination on the basis of race still legal? Can someone just openly, do that? No, I mean, we have laws, in terms of hiring, anti-discrimination laws, and laws, basically equal hiring, equal opportunity. In terms of housing, same sort of deal. People legally cannot openly discriminate. Now, is there any legal discrimination that still remains?
Freedom of speech.
Any other types?
Not all states have gay marriage, I guess.
Yeah, if we move away from ethnicity, there are things. Some people would say that that's discrimination. Other people would say, well, to allow it would be discrimination against religion. Yeah, for the most part, though, discrimination on race is totally illegal now. So then the good question is, it does occur, and then the question would be, how does it occur if it's totally illegal? Well, what are some forms? I guess we can give some concrete stuff. What forms does discrimination take, discrimination based on ethnicity and race take today? How does it manifest itself?
I feel like you can still see, even though it's illegal, you can still see it in the workplace or even at schools, in your personal life as well. Like just running into people, they can discriminate against you.
Yeah, I mean, and of course what people often say is like when people say they're being discriminated against, people often say, oh, it's just, they just think they are. They feel that way. Which is why, since we don't have it in laws, one way to test it is through sort of objective studies. For example, you might have heard of one of the things they tested is there was a study done and people were wondering, is there discrimination against African Americans or minorities in general in terms of hiring? And they thought, well, here's a way to test it. They took, a large number of help wanted, basically job applications, and sent resumes to them. And they, put on like resumes that were essentially the same, education, qualifications, and they put a name that was, stereotypically white on it. And they put a name that was stereotypical minority on it, and then send them off and see what the results were. What were the results?
The person who was stereotypically white received more calls than the minorities.
Yes, and people might say, well, is that discrimination? And the answer is yes, because the way they were set up for, the people were equally qualified. So if it was based on qualifications, you'd expect a little variation just by pure chance, but you'd expect not the big variation that there actually was. And similarly, like with the follow-up as well. And the discrimination they found held at like all levels, at all education levels, in terms of like the job requirements. And so that was a pretty conclusive, given the size of the study, fairly conclusive. Now, what other types of discrimination manifest today? Like, what's one thing that's been in the news quite a bit?
Police.
Yeah, the way police treat minorities. And, you know, what people do is, of course, people would say, you know, there'd be anecdotes. People would say the police, you know, they treat people differently. And then, of course, the police give back anecdote, you know, people give defense anecdotes as well. Which is why, of course, if we're gonna, you know, if you're gonna make a sort of objective case, that's where statistics and numbers, I mean, statistics and numbers are kind of cold. They're not as dramatic as a story, but they lay out the facts. So what we look at, for example, is, you know, incidents of, you know, violence, arrest rates, etc. Now, is there statistical evidence of discrimination there?
With like the police.
Well, police, in general.
Yes.
Yeah, what evidence is there? Or what findings are there?
Well, are you talking about like in numbers or the cases that we see?
Well, there are the cases we do see. I mean, we can point to, you know, stories in the news, you know, famous cases that have occurred. But if we go, you know, by the numbers, what kind of numbers do we get? I mean, I don't mean like exact.
Like statistics?
Yeah. We don't have to like quote out a particular number, but
Percentage of blacks in prisons.
yeah.
We also do the difference between how people get charged with cocaine compared to coke. You know, cocaine is more so considered high price than coke. You know, that's kind of.
Yeah, the war on drugs has been, you know, systematically discriminating. As you point out, there's different sentencing for different types of drugs, and also sentences. If you go by, you know, same crime, and you go by the defendant's ethnicity, minorities get harsher, in general, get harsher and longer sentences, and so you end up with, you know, large percentage of people in prisons for a longer time, even for the same sorts of crimes. Also, if we look at, well, one thing, again, going with the statistical analysis, one thing they looked at especially is traffic stops. And they found that if there's a traffic stop, minorities are more likely to be stopped, you know, in traffic, more likely to be searched, even though, interestingly enough, who's more likely to have illegal stuff in their car?
Anybody.
No, actually, it divides along racial lines.
You say illegal stuff?
Illegal stuff.
Like tents and things like that?
Oh, no, illegal stuff like drugs.
Or
Yeah.
drugs?
Like corporate America.
Yeah, because drugs are expensive. No, they found, interestingly, that, you know, statistically, whites are more likely to have that.
Yeah.
For real. Why? Because people know how the system works. A person is less likely to be stopped if they're white. So they're less likely to actually, you know, they're more likely to just, you know, say, oh, the chance of me getting stopped is really low. And if they stop me, they're probably not gonna search me. Yeah, and so we do have, you know, clear discrimination. Now again, the anecdotes are just people telling stories. And anecdotes are interesting, but there's a reason why this is called a fallacy of anecdotal evidence. A story doesn't, you know, but I mean, it does say stuff about that particular case, but it doesn't tell us about how things go in general. So if we go to the example of the officer, you know, on videotape who shot the person in the back, we know that's awful. But it tells us that does occur, but it doesn't tell us, you know, broadly what sort of discrimination occurs. And that's where sort of the cold statistics come into play. Now, since it's a matter of, you know, statistics and facts, people do argue against that. They claim that the studies are, I mean, the usual stuff you can argue about studies. Are the studies actually biased? Are they accurate? Or is it just, is there a causal connection, or is it just due to random chance? But the numbers do seem to be showing discrimination. Now, the sort of, you know, arrests, shootings, imprisonments are very blatant examples of discrimination. But are there more subtle examples of discrimination?
Yes,
Yeah.
like I do know, like in like the corporate world, natural hair isn't as accepted as the typical European look with straight hair.
Yeah, there's
Even
discrimination.
in schools, there, like private schools.
Yeah, the people's appearance. For example, there was that sort of blew up a while back where they lightened Beyonce, I think, to make her, you know, to make her more appealing. And they've done that in other models as well, like lightening people. And that's a form of, you know, more subtle. It's not like shooting people in the back discrimination, but still a form of discrimination. Now, what about in education? Is there discrimination?
Almost, probably, yeah, of course.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, the answer is always yeah, of course. Now, one reason why discrimination occurs is because you may wonder, like, well, how do people do this without, you know, by following the law? We can take one example. Take the state of Florida. As you might be familiar with, the state schools, which FAMU is one, we're under what's called the performance-based funding model. And the idea is we have to meet these objectives, and the Florida public schools are ranked. And the schools that get in the top, they get more money. The schools that are on the bottom, they get a penalty. Now, one issue, of course, is no matter what, there's always going to be 3 schools losing money. So we could all be doing an incredibly great job, but 3 schools have to get, you know, get punished, which we could regard as unfair. Now, the way the standards are set, they are objective, they go by numbers, but one thing to consider is, are the standards actually fair? Now, the way it's set is, you know, some of the main ones include things that seem reasonable. Graduation rate, cost, salary of the graduates, you know, their job placement, and those are all things that seem objective and fair. I mean, after all, a successful school graduates people, you know, hopefully by 6 years. They have a high job placement rate, and the salaries are good. That is that's objective measures of success. But how could what may be regarded as discrimination be worked into there? Well, one thing to consider would be, if you're looking at like school performance, is not just what is their output, but what sort of challenges do they face. For example, the top ranked school is University of Florida. They have about an 80, well, last figures that I saw were about 86% graduation rate, 6 year, which is phenomenal. That's exceptional. So their graduates have a very high job placement rate. They also, their median salary is quite good. It's a good school. Nothing against University of Florida, they're doing a great job. Now at FAMU, of course, we have a much lower graduation rate, and our job placement isn't as good, and the average salaries is not as good. And so we're bottom in the school, in the state rankings. Now you might say, how could that be potentially discrimination? Because, you know, we're all ranked by the same standards. It seemed to be objective, reasonable standards, but how could that be discrimination?
I guess the challenges that the students face at the school to meet those requirements. And even like with jobs, like you said, sometimes even though it's illegal, you are discriminated, so you may not get the job. Or since we're minorities, you're probably going to get paid less than those people who are not minorities.
Yeah, exactly right. And if you just, again, going back to just the numbers, FAMU is majority low-income students, like 52%. University of Florida is, I think, around like 11 or 12%. And so if you have people who are higher income, that allows for a whole bunch of advantages. They probably went to better high schools. They were able, in terms of like paying for school, they would be less likely to have to work. Because the main reason people drop out of school is often economics. They can't afford it. So if you have, you know, people who are higher income, less need to work, more likely to be able to pay for it, and so they're more likely to graduate. And as you pointed out, if we go by hiring and salary, if there's discrimination based on race when it comes to hiring and salary, you know, FAMU, historically black college and university, that's going to knock down our numbers. Is it the fault of the school? No. You know, if we have racism that's lowering people's salaries and their chance of being hired, it's unfair to assess a school based on that. You know, to say you're not doing as good a job because society is racist. So you're doing bad. Now, interesting to mention before, there was an alternative ranking given what's called the Social Mobility Index, which looks at how good a school is at lifting people from lower income to success. And although FAMU is at the bottom of the state rankings, we're number 19 in the country in terms of, social mobility. Basically, bringing people lower income up. And not surprisingly, the University of Florida is like 256. They're not awful, but they're way, way down. Interestingly enough, the ranking done by the state is actually an inversion of social mobility. Not surprisingly, because there's a clear correlation between what income class students come from and graduation rates. So University of Florida does a great job moving people from, success to success. And other schools do a good job moving people from lower income to higher income, but of course that's more challenging. So something that is discrimination. Our budget is constantly being chopped. You might have heard in the news that people are saying FAMU is doing a terrible job, we have a terrible graduation rate. But you might say, well, fairness requires that we consider, is the assessment fair? Yes, our students have a lower job placement rate, but racism is a major factor. Our students have lower salaries, but racism is a factor. And so it's discrimination kind of perpetuating itself. The idea being that we have discrimination in society, and then we're discriminated against as well. So yeah, discrimination still seems to be a problem. Can it be fixed?
I guess with tougher laws.
Yeah, we could have tougher laws. But do people still discriminate even when it's illegal?
Yes.
Yeah. So one challenge, of course, is faced is how do we deal with discrimination that is, occurring, even though there are plenty of laws. And the main thing, of course, as people point out, you can't legislate people's attitudes. And some people are pessimistic. They believe that this is always going to be a problem. That no matter what, there's always going to be discrimination. And some people would say, well, it may change form. For example, if you look at the United States, there's been discrimination just constantly. And we generally typically think of it as like, whites versus non-whites. But in US history, have whites been discriminated against? Well, if you look at signs, from the 1800s, they would say no Irish, for example. And even though Irish are well integrated now, there was a time when they were heavily discriminated against. And so one thing may be, well, maybe time. Or maybe that, the comedians often say everyone gets their turn. So like a new group comes along, they discriminate against, and we'll always have discrimination. But it's an important question. Is there anything we can do about it? Or is it something we're always doomed to suffer from? Third factor is poverty. 1863, poverty problem. 1963, problem. 2015?
Yes.
Yeah, poverty seems like a constant.
So that's not going away.
Yeah, I mean, we do have economic, we could do economic inequality as well. And, going back to social mobility, one point of concern, of course, is, Bernie Sanders, brings up all these numbers all the time, but there are statistics that, these are things you can check, they're objective, what are the stats? And as people, do point out, typically Democrats, income for the rest of us has been steadily, if you adjust for inflation, is actually lower and lower. We make, and one thing we have to account for is, of course, inflation. In terms of like just plain up, numbers, seems like more, but adjusted for inflation, we're actually doing worse now. Now, you can also, of course, then bring in the factors of ethnicity and race. And does poverty often parallel, race and ethnicity?
Yes.
Yeah, the good question is, why is that? Some people give explanations, that are racist themselves. But it's a good question. Why, obviously we know why poverty was a problem in 1863. Because people were treated as property. And if you're property, you don't have, by definition, you own really nothing. And of course, 63, we're still, close to that time period. Now what about 2015? Some people have said that, oh yes, that was all bad, slavery was bad, blah, blah, but, now it's 2015. There can't be an excuse anymore. But why does the poverty still persist? Why is it still a problem?
Because discrimination and segregation still?
Yes. And also there's a matter of wealth. One interesting analysis has been done about housing and wealth, that if we go back to like discriminations, if there's like discrimination which people now accept, discrimination in 1963, if people weren't accumulating wealth, family wealth like then, what happens relative to people who have been accumulating it since like,
You're behind.
yeah, you're way, way behind. And so one thing that we're, discrimination, segregation build on is that people don't build, like I say in the financial commercials, people don't build wealth. And so we have a sharp class division, obviously people have less by definition. There's also a sharp, racial division in terms of the wealth that people have. And if people don't accumulate wealth, then it makes it harder for each generation. And so to say, when people say, well, get over it, well, the thing about history is that what we have today depends on what we had in the past. So if someone's family has been accumulating, house, stocks, bonds, and et cetera, for 100 years or 200 years, they can be very well off. If people have not been able to accumulate wealth hardly at all, they're going to be worse off because everything else depends on wealth. And so poverty is still a problem. So next time, we'll look at his argument as to morally the foundation for the claim for equality, and his look at when it should occur and how it should occur. Violence or non-violence. We already know the answer, but worth discussing. So next time on Friday, we'll press on to more stuff. So have a good Wednesday, and I'll see you on the Friday.